All right, well, if you're just joining us for the first time this week, we are in part 3 of a series called Pointing the Finger. And what we're talking about is judging. Now, judging is one of those things that really, it's like a big umbrella term. It kind of, touches on a lot of different aspects of life, right? There are a lot of different ways we can judge. What we're talking about, for the most part, is in our relationships, in our interactions with one another. When I see the need to look at your behavior or something you believe or where you stand and assess the situation and deliver a verdict, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about judgment. So I'll tell you a little story. I remember when I was in college, and for the first time, really, I started considering working in the church, right? Like studying ministry. I decided I was going to go on AOL Instant Messenger. Anybody remember that? You got the screen name, Anyway, so I go on AOL Instant Messenger, and I message one of my friends who happened to be online back home as a teenage girl, right? Probably around 18, 19 years old. And one of my friends, and I said, hey, I'm away at school. How you doing? Had small talk. And I was like, listen, I think I decided what I'm going to study in school. She was like, oh, well, that's so great. Congratulations. What are you going to study? And I said, ministry. I think I want to work in a church. And I'll never forget her response. It came in 3 little bubbles, right? She said, oh, God, Lewis, why? And, the conversation was pretty interesting after that. But basically what she was getting at, where we ended, was this question that a lot of people feel, but not a lot of people ask. What she was asking was, why would anyone want to go to church? Maybe there are some people that feel like they have to be in church or should be in church, but why is it that someone, how could you actually want that? Now, she's speaking as somebody who's outside the church, who doesn't consider herself a follower of Jesus. And really, what she's expressing, and we've spoken about this over the past couple weeks, is this reputation the church has earned for itself in our country, right? I told you about a study that was done by a group called the Barna Group, where they asked people who don't go to church to describe the church in one word. And over 90% of the responses were some form of the word judgmental. The church. This is coming from people outside the church. And so here's what hangs in the balance. Here's really the reason why we're doing this series. If you are someone who follows Jesus, someone who considers themselves a person of faith, this is too big an issue for us to ignore, right? As people who are supposed to be known for the way we care, really, we shouldn't be known as people who are judgmental, right? But if you're someone who's outside the church, maybe you were dragged here today, or someone's forcing you or threatening you, and you're here and you're like, just wrap it up, I want to go home, right? If that's you, I'm willing to bet this is part of the reason why. Maybe you had some kind of interaction with maybe some well-intentioned people of faith, but they judged you. You felt like they were judgmental, and you decided, nah, I'm going to create some distance between me and all of that. And so maybe this was it. And the good news is it's not supposed to be that way. Or whether you're a person of faith or not, right now our culture is in a war of finger pointing, right? There is a blame game going on. There's a lot of judging. And I don't know if you've realized, but it really hasn't helped the situation. It's just made us more defensive and divisive. And what's amazing is if we'll look at some of these teachings of Jesus, I think you'll see that no matter where you are in your faith journey, right? I think you'll see that this is a better way. That there's a better way to handle this whole idea of judgment. So that's what the series has been about so far. We've been looking at four ways to avoid the blame game, or four keys really to a good kind of judgment that's actually helpful and not harmful. And so on week one, we said really what it comes down to, like the foundation of this whole idea is that we have to start with why. Why? When I feel the need to deliver a verdict, to drop the hammer, why do I feel that need? And we looked at a passage where the Apostle Paul wrote that everything should be done out of love, including when I need to tell you something about how you're behaving. When there's some form of judgment, it should be done out of love. And so if that's a little too abstract for you, this whole idea of love, because that can really include a lot of things, the question we said is, am I judging for the good of the judged? Do I genuinely care about you when making this judgment? Or is this for me? Is this for me to feel good about myself, to feel like I'm on the right side, to put you in your place, to retaliate? Or am I genuinely concerned? And I think you'll see if you start with that, you're genuinely concerned with other people, that will affect your approach. It's the foundation that this whole thing is built on. We start with why. The second thing we said is that in our judgments, we tend to be too quick and too confident. We tend to judge too quickly, and we tend to be too sure of those judgments when we make those judgments. And so we looked at a passage where Jesus said, he set up this metaphor between your friend or your brother or someone you're like having a speck in their eye. He's like, first, check yourself for a plank. Right? He said, if you not only start with why, but commit to going first, other things tend to just fall into place. Like maybe it's actually an issue with you that's causing you to want to speak up and address this person. Maybe we reach for the hammer and it might actually show us something that we see in the mirror. And so we said last week, we should be a little bit quicker with the mirror and a little bit slower with the hammer. And what's amazing is that Jesus said that if you do that, then you'll be able to see clearly and remove the speck from your brother's eye. When we deal with our own issues, it actually helps us to deal with the issues of other people if we need to do that. So this week, we're on our third one, and this is a little bit of like a family chat, right? So if you're somebody who follows Jesus, somebody who considers himself a person of faith or an insider, this was written to and for you. For us. Like I said, it's like a family chat. However, if you're someone, like I said, who is forced to be here, who does not, you are not on board with the whole faith thing, you're just here to make somebody happy or whatever, this is a really cool family chat to sit in on, and my hope is that it will give you some relief and some clarity. So I'll tell you a story. When I was in 6th grade, I had this book report project, and I had to figure out what I was going to do. And it was about the characters in the story, and we had to get oak tag. Anybody remember oak tag when you did a little report, right? And we had to put these key characters in the oak tag and present it and whatever. And I'm listening to the teacher present it. I'm like, oh no, I got an idea, right? I'm going to take a poster board. The ones with the little wings, they fold open, you can display things. And I'm like, I wonder if you folded them, if they would close perfectly, like doors. And then you open them, boom, keys on the inside. And I'm like, this is going to be amazing if I can pull this off. I'm sitting there in my little 6th grade seat. I'm so excited. I got a good idea. And when you got a good idea and you just can't keep it to yourself, right? I was suffering from that. And so I looked at my friend, or so I thought, and I was like, hey, I got this really good idea. Now, this guy was like a mastermind. He looks at me and he's like, oh yeah, you got a good idea? And I was like, yeah. He's like, I think my idea is probably better than your idea. And I was like, really? And he goes, yeah, but I'm not going to tell you. And I was like, no, listen, I'll tell you my idea. We just got to promise, you promise you won't take my idea. I promise I won't take your idea. He's like, okay, fine. I'll tell you my idea. So he tells me his idea with what he's going to do with his keys. This was a long time ago. I don't remember what his idea was, but I could tell you, dumb. Wasn't a good idea, all right? And then I tell him, I'm like, oh yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these doors, I'm going to put the keys on the inside. And he looks at me, he goes, that is a good idea. I'm going to do that. And I was like, you can't do that. You can't. And he's like, no, I'm going to do it. I'm like, okay, yeah, whatever. There's no way he's going to do that. It's not whatever. The next day, I go home. I didn't actually do that because, I don't know, maybe I forgot to ask my parents to take me to the store or whatever, right? But I didn't end up doing the idea I had. But we come in the next day, and guess he comes in with the doors, and I'm just like, you gotta be kidding me. And the teachers are like, oh, wow, what an amazing idea. It's so fantastic. He's just sitting there like basking in his glory. And we get back to our seats, and I look at him, and I was like, you promised that you weren't gonna do that. And he said, yeah, I did. And I was like, and you lied. And he goes, yeah, I did. What are you gonna do about it? And I'm looking at him just outraged. And I was in 6th grade, and I still wasn't totally sold on God and the church. But I remember thinking, like, there was just no appealing to any source of moral authority to this guy. You know, I remember just thinking, like, you're not even gonna like try and make some reason why it was like, you're just, nope, I don't care. It seemed like, again, I wasn't like very spiritual in 6th grade, but I'm looking at him like, it's like there was no appealing to some kind of higher power, right? None. He just didn't care. He didn't care. Think of someone in your life with whom there is no appealing to a higher power. Like you just wouldn't mention God around them. Or it's uncomfortable if you mention God around them. Maybe it's not like, maybe they're great people, right? Maybe there's not a huge difference in morals, but you just like, if they ask you to do something Sunday morning, it feels like more comfortable to tell them you're busy rather than that you're going to church, because to them, it's just not something that they would take seriously. All right, like if there's a faith boat, like they're just like, no, I'm not on that. Or maybe we could go a little bit more extreme. Maybe there's someone there's like no appealing to God with them, but it's more extreme. Like you look at their lifestyle and you're like, I totally disagree and I totally disapprove with what they're doing and how they're doing it. Or maybe you could say like, maybe it's the people you don't want your kids to hang out with. You wouldn't want them to influence your kids. Or maybe it's people that you have real negative feelings toward. Maybe it's people on the opposite side of your political view, if you want to get like a little hairy, right? Like maybe it's them, they, the other side, whatever side you're on. Like these people that you just feel like they're out of whack. There's no appealing to God with them, right? The Apostle Paul, we're talking about judgment. The Apostle Paul talks about how we should handle judgment when it comes to people who are not on the same page with us in the faith world. And it's pretty interesting what he has to say. He's writing a letter to a church in a city called Corinth. Now, this city was pretty messed up. There were some crazy things going on. There were all these arguments, like there was discrimination based on like class and ability. They were measuring each other against one another. Their sexual ethics were crazy. There was one guy who was sleeping with his father's wife, and you can interpret that however you want to. It could have been his mom, it could have been his step. And there seemed to be this culture of like, it's cool. In the church in Corinth. They had let a lot of stuff. And so Paul writes them a letter. And in this letter, he's pretty hot, right? Like he's pretty intense. We talked last week about how there's a time to grab the mirror and then there's a time to like, grab the hammer. Yeah. It's hammer time for Paul. Like he sounds like really annoyed. And in his writing, he does say in the beginning, like he's speaking to them as children that he loves, but he's still pretty intense. It feels a little bit like he's playing whack-a-mole, right? And so he goes on, and I'm summarizing here, but here's what he says. He says, I wrote to you in my letter, and we don't know exactly what letter he's talking about, but he says, I wrote to you. We communicated at some point. And I said, like, there are people, they're greedy. There are people that, like, we don't agree with their sexual ethics. They're slanderers. They're gossips. He's like, I wrote to you and I told you not to associate or not to live in a way that expresses approval of this kind of behavior. But then he stops to clarify. And here's what he says, right? I remember where I was when I read this. He says, not at all, meaning the people of this world. Now, if you're not familiar with that phrase, like this world, he's not talking about aliens and like earthlings, right? He's talking about people that live by the norms of society. He's like, I am not at all talking about them. He goes on as if to clarify a little bit further. A few verses later, he asks this question. Ready? In case you're like not sure what he means. He says, what business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? There's this implication here. It's a rhetorical question. He's implying none. Like, it's none of my business. Now just think about this. This is Paul, right? Like, this is the most Christian there ever was. He started all these churches. He's responsible for writing tons of the New Testament scriptures. And he's saying, like, if what we believe is a cereal, he's on the box, right? Like, he is the guy. He has done so, or maybe Jesus is on the box, but he's like on the back with the maze, you know? And he's like, he said, for me, it's not my business. It's not my business. Like, they never signed up for what we signed up for. They never agreed to live by these standards. In other words, like, your friends who are not part of church, who are not followers of Jesus, if you're a follower of Jesus, like, they should never feel judged when they're around us. This is a real issue for me, right? Because when I meet new people, like, eventually the conversation comes up where it's like, oh, what do you do for a living? And then I try to avoid that conversation for as long as possible, but eventually comes up and I'm like, well, I'm a pastor, you know? And you could just see, like, they just step back. It's like they feel judged and they're thinking, like, how many curses did I say in the last couple minutes because there's this assumption that it's my job to, like, be the moral police of the world. And Paul's like, no, like, they never signed up for this. Like, your friends who are not part of it, they shouldn't know what your hammer looks like. Now, I think it's important to make a little disclaimer here. We're not talking about, like, justice in society, right? If someone is getting hurt or doing something that's causing harm to other people, we should step in and defend the weak. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about in our interpersonal relationships with your neighbor, with your friend, with your coworker, with your student. They have, like, they're doing something that you're like, in my circle, that's not okay. He's like, it's not our place. They never signed up for that. I've got a friend. His name is Mitch. I told you about him last week. He's the chandelier guy, right? If you remember the story from last week. Yeah, funny guy. But he insisted on playing this game called Punch Buggy. You ever play Punch Buggy? Dumb game. Just real bad game. In case you've never played the game, you're not missing out. Here's how it goes. At any point, at any time, anywhere, in any situation, for any reason, if a Volkswagen Bug passes by, the first person that sees it gets to yell punch buggy, and then you say the color of the vehicle, and you just punch the person who's sitting next to you. And then you say no backs, and they can't do it back to you. And he insisted on playing this game all throughout high school and then into college. And he was bigger than me, and he was stronger than me, and he had these huge hands with big bony knuckles. And, like, he always saw it before I did. So we'd just be sitting there, we'd be driving in the car, we'd have some, like, nice, meaningful conversation, be like, punch buggy green, boom. And he just would light up my arm, and my arm would be dead for the next, like, 3 minutes. And I don't know how many times I told him, like, look, man, I don't want to play your dumb game. I'm tired of living in fear when we're on the road together that some Volkswagen is going to drive by. Like, just let me off the hook. But he wouldn't. And we just kept on going, and he kept on slugging me, right? He was forcing me, ready? He was forcing me to play by the rules of a game I never agreed to play. And that's what the church has earned a reputation for doing. We believe this. We believe this is right. We believe it's supposed to be that way, and you're not doing that, and we have a problem with that. And Paul's like, no, they never signed up for this. Let's step back for a second, right? And maybe this will help things fall into place. Here's how Christianity works, right? In summary. And we've spoken a little bit about this. Well, probably a lot about this. We believe that there is a God who took the first step, right? Who expressed his love for us. Jesus died on the cross for us. And the Apostle Paul, when he wrote in a church in his letter to a church in Rome, he said, like, what else? Like, if he is willing to give it all up for us, what else does he have to do to show us that he's for us? He says, if God is for us, then who can be against us? In other words, like, when we believe that was a display of God's love for us. right? And so he's like, okay, so like in any other relationship, there is love expressed. God took the first step, right? Then from there, like trust develops. Like, you know what? You really do care. You really do want what's best for me. And what do we do with people or authorities that we trust? Well, then we listen to them. And this is what we would call obedience. You have shown me your love. You've shown me I can trust you. And now you tell me to go this way. I'll listen because I know you're in my corner. Even though it might be hard, even though I might not understand, trust comes before always obedience. When you judge someone who doesn't believe what you believe, you're skipping this whole process and holding them accountable to obeying someone that they maybe don't believe is real, maybe don't believe has their best in mind, maybe doesn't understand the extent to which God has gone to express his love for them. And so you're skipping the whole process. And so if on week 1, we talked about starting with why, right? Making sure you're concerned about someone's good. And week 2, we talked about going first so that you can see clearly. Like this week, we might say, stay in your lane. What business is it of mine? The people outside the church should never feel like they are being judged by those inside the church. But there's an implication here. And Paul continues in this same verse. He says, what business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Rhetorical question, none. But then he goes on, he says, but are you not to judge those inside? This statement has to be seen in light of what we talked about the last 2 weeks. Are you doing it for the good, for their good? And have you checked yourself first to make sure it's not an issue you have that you're throwing onto them? Right? And again, now let's step back, right? Let's look at what we just thought. How does Christianity work? Well, if I believe that there's a God who loves me, if I believe that he has my best in mind and I can trust him, and I've decided, you know what, I'm going to follow Jesus and listen to him. When I step out of place, I want someone who loves me to be like, hey man, this is not the way you want to go. When it's for my good. That's what community is. When Tom and I first started working together, it was a while ago, maybe, a year and a half. I haven't kept track of time over the last 2 years. But I remember one day I came in and I had just had an argument with Allie that morning. And it wasn't just a little thing. It was a bigger thing than normal. And so I was frustrated about it. I came in, I started talking to Tom about it. And he looked at me and he was like, I don't remember exactly what the issue was about, but he's like, is she sure, have you made it totally clear in this situation how much you appreciate what she did? And I was like, I don't know. And he was like, yeah, I don't know if you should just stay here and sit in this. He's like, I think maybe you should, I live 2 miles down the road. So I think maybe you should go home and just sort that out and then come back here. Now, that's not the right thing to do in every situation. Fortunately, my schedule that day allowed for that, and I'm right down the road. And so, he told me, I should go home. That was a judgment. And now I don't tell him anything, ever. No, but when it comes to marriage and work, we are on the same page. We believe the same thing. We believe that God has told us as husbands to put our wives above everything else, even my job. And so there is a time to press pause over here to make sure things are right over. And I know that, and I believe that. And all of a sudden, someone who cares about me sees me kind of stray, and he's like, wait a minute, I think we know what the best course of action here is. And I said, you know what, you're right. And I got in the car, and I'm glad I did. It was 100% right, and the rest of my day was 100% better. There is a place for good judgment, but it has to come out of love. The problem with the church in Corinth was that they were turning a blind eye to what was going on the inside, all the garbage that had seeped into the church, and yet they felt the ability to look at the outside and be got a problem with that, got a problem with that, got a problem with that. And really, that's kind of seeped, it's continued for thousands of years. In a lot of ways, that's the story of the church, where we'll like look at what's going on the inside, be like, all right, whatever, you're okay. But like look at the world and be like, we are not okay with that. We're not okay with that. We're not okay with that. And so we've earned ourselves a reputation of being judgmental. In a lot of circles, if you talk to a lot of church people, what you'll hear people in the church talk about often is what the problem is with the world, right? But I think what Paul is saying here, is that no, the problem is not with the world. The problem is with the church. And if we would just stick to what's going on, like if we were to get our own house in order here, the world wouldn't look at us as a bunch of judgmental people. Like at worst, they would look at us and be like, those people, they hold themselves to a standard that like there's something attractive about it. There's something good to it. But yeah, they don't talk, like they don't get in our business. Like maybe they look at us and be like, I would love for my daughter to marry one of those guys. I would love for my son to marry one of those girls. I'd love to work for one of them. I'd love to have them work. Like there's something about that is so good. But yeah, they're not meddling in my business. So Paul says, what business is it of mine to judge the world? And this is why the Barna study, it's the third week I've brought it up, that the world sees the church as judgmental. This isn't an inconvenient thing. This isn't like, it's unfortunate. Don't you wish they liked us? This is a problem. It's not supposed to be this way. Something needs to be fixed. And so I told you in every message this series, we would talk about when you're pointing the finger and when the finger is pointed back at you. And so if the finger's pointed at you, if you're someone who doesn't go to church, you're listening into this family meeting, right? And you have had the finger pointed at you, there's been a person of faith, maybe a well-intentioned person of faith, who's made you feel judged. That's on us. That wasn't supposed to happen. And my hope, my genuine hope for you is that you wouldn't let a well-intentioned, maybe, but inappropriate judgment get in the way of you being open to having a relationship with a God who loves you. A God who loves you and will challenge you, who loves you too much to let you continue to live in destructive patterns, but a God who genuinely wants your best and has done everything to show that to you. So then the question is, what do we do? What do you do if you're a person inside the church? How do we handle people on the outside of the church? What should our approach be if you see someone and their way of living doesn't line up with what you believe to be right, what you believe to be true? Well, in this same letter, Paul, he goes on a little bit of a rant. And here's what he says, talking about these people. He says, though I'm free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone. Now, there's some important context here. A slave in Roman culture was very different than a slave in American history. What he's saying is that he has taken the posture of service, of looking for the good of other people. Ready? And here's why. Here's why. He says to win as many as possible. And then he breaks this down a little bit, as if to give us some examples. He says, to the Jews, I became like a Jew. Why? To win the Jews. He says, to those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law. Why? So as to win those under the law. He goes on and he says, to those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I myself am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. He says, to the weak, I became weak to win the weak. And then he says this verse, which has become pretty well known. He says, I have become all things to all people so that by all possible means I might save some. His approach is to win people over. To win people over. He writes to one of his apprentices named Titus. He's talking about people who work. He says, tell them to work in such a way that makes what they believe attractive. This was the early church. When the church first started, in its baby form, it says that the church grew in favor with God and with people. People looked in from the outside and they were like, I I want in on that. There's something good about that way of life. And so they weren't guilted into it. They weren't like forced into it. They weren't scared into it. They were drawn into it. Why? Because they played for the win. When they saw people, they tried to win them over. And so my question for you is your goodness attractive? Is your faith attractive? What if people liked us more because of our faith, not less? Right? Like, do people look at you and wonder, why do they care so much about the health of their marriage? Why do they give time and energy to people everybody else overlooks? Why do they stand out? Like, why is their standard of, not like they walk around like pointing the finger at everybody like, you got it, but like when I watch how they are, even when they think no one else, there's something different about them. It's attractive. And it's attractive. What if people liked us more because of what we believe, not less? I'll leave you with this story. I'll ask the band to come up. We're about to wrap up here. But I heard a story about a pastor who went to China on a trip just to learn about China. He went on this tour. Now, in China, the church is doing really well. It's not easy to be a Christian in China. Their laws make it a little bit difficult to be a Christian. It's complicated, but there's a lot on the line when someone decides they want to follow Jesus in China. However, the church continues to grow over there. And there was a girl who was actually the translator for this tour. And she's walking around, and she had just recently become a follower of Jesus. She had an encounter with the church and had started reading the teachings of Jesus on her own. And at the end of the tour guide stops. He looks at everybody, looks at the pastor, the whole group, and says, does anyone have any questions? And a hand goes up from the translator. Someone that had experienced the church in a really, really healthy form. She pointed at the pastor. She said, are you a pastor in the U.S.? He was a pretty well-known guy, and so she must have recognized him. And he was caught off guard because he's one of the people on the tour. And he looked at her, he said, yes, I am. You know what she said to him? She said, why doesn't everyone want to go to church? Like, it just didn't make sense to her that people wouldn't want to be part of this based on what she had seen and what she had read. It was attractive. It was beautiful. She was drawn to it. And so my question is, what do we as a church, as a culture, like starting here, starting in this church, starting in your own home, starting in your own heart, what do we need to do to get from, like, why would anyone want to why doesn't everyone want to? What do we need to do? I think it starts with the reputation of the church. It starts how we handle this whole issue of judgment. We need to change the way people think about the church if we want to change the way they think about God.